Santiago de Chile. Oh, sorry, and we're recording. I'm a member of TULI, and we will be sharing, and I'm gonna chairing today. And I'm very happy to welcome you to our joint event with the Transition Security Project titled Labor on the U.S. Military Complex from Mid-Century Strengths to a Dead-End Future. So first of all, I want to start introducing our great presenter, Taylor Barnes. She's a field reporter with the nonprofit outlet Instinct Media, where she covers the people and places tied to the United States 1 trillion military budget. It's even hard to say that so much money. She also published the newsletter Military Industrial America on Substacks. And also, I want to introduce you to our great discussants, Faisy Ismail. She's a lecturer at Goldsmith, University of London, whose research examines the impacts of alternatives to neoliberalism and imperialism, the politics of climate change and movements confronting the climate crisis, and the intersection of politics, labor, and development in Nepal and South Asia. So Faisy will guide the conversation today with Taylor. But also, before starting, I have a couple of things to say. First of all, I want to briefly present ourselves, TULI, for those who join us for the first time. We are the Trade Union and Labor Environmentalism Network, a network of early career researchers that explores broadly how trade unions can advance working class environmentalism. We come from different parts of the world and different disciplines. As I mentioned, I'm from Santiago de Chile. There's some people in Canada, in the US, in Europe, etc., in Asia. We meet monthly, and we are very open to welcoming new members. My colleague will share our Intake link in the chat along with the sign up for our excellent newsletter. Also, I want to mention that our next event, it will be on May the 11th. It will be our second session of our shop floor series with Jenny Roten from IG Metall of Germany, who will discuss collective bargaining as a tool for protecting workers amidst the industrial crisis impacting core sectors of the German economy, such as automotive and steel, in the context of the green transition. That will be, as I mentioned, on the 11th of May, 9 a.m. EST time, 3 p.m. CET time, and the registration link will be also in the chat. We're also running a fundraising campaign to support participants attending to our mini conference on labor and just transitions in the next SACE conference in Bordeaux, France. That is in international. These international academic conferences are increasingly expensive, and we want to make sure that voices from the Global South and also early career researchers can be part of this conversation. Of course, we're talking about people who don't have any funding support. So if you can spare a few dollars, please consider donating. The link will also be in the chat. So that's it with the with announcing things. Welcome, Taylor. Thank you very much, Taylor, and also welcome and thank you very much, Faisy. We're very happy to have you today. This event will last 1 hour, 1 hour and a half. Taylor will present us a very interesting report she's working on, and she already finished. And then Faisy will make some questions, some discussions, some comments, and then we will have a space for Q&A. And yeah, please remember to turn off your cameras during the presentation as we're recording, and we'll upload this to our YouTube channel. Again, thank you very much, and please, Taylor.
Thank you very much, Lucas, and thank you everyone for being here. I'm really excited that you guys reached out, and you happened to reach out right around the time that I was producing this report that I hope is very much up your alley. I thought maybe I could give a quick introduction of myself, and Faisy, would you like to follow? And then I'll start diving into the report. My day job is as a field reporter with a nonprofit media outlet called Inkstick Media, and we call this position field reporter for the military industrial complex. So we cover the people and places in the US that are tied up in the nowadays $1 trillion Pentagon budget. Donald Trump would like it to be 1.5 trillion next year. It's an astounding figure. And the origin of this beat really is from my own perspective was for me starting to see endless war as just a defining feature of modern American life. Sometimes we've written in our stories and whatnot that this is a bit cheesy, but in the same way that a fish is unaware that it lives in water, Americans rarely contemplate this fundamental feature of their modern life, which is endless war and endless preparation for war. Um, and as I started to get interested in that space and read some of the greats, like I must call her out, Miriam Pemberton, who is on this call, who has written just one of the defining books about this topic, and a policy scholar with such rich experience in this area, I started to hear a recurring theme from watchdogs, journalists, observers of the space, which is, we can tell you everything that's wrong with the F-35 and how it only is able to fly correctly a third of the time. We can tell you everything that's wrong with why the United States doesn't need a new nuclear missile. However, none of that will change until the parochial politics on the ground change. There's a reason Congress votes to fund this over and over again, and they see it as a way to funnel money into their districts, to claim to create jobs. I'll discuss him in a minute, but the late great president of the Machinists Union, who I will introduce you guys to, William Wimpesinger, once referred to job creation through the arms industry as quote unquote technological leaf raking, which I found to be a very vivid description. So after sort of hearing that sort of criticism, I thought, great, like what could be my role as an investigative journalist is dive into those parochial politics, expose that, try and for example, counter a space that the arms industry occupies so thoroughly. Um, if you look at just how the likes of Lockheed Martin or Anduril or Northrop Grumman behave on the ground, they are very preoccupied with their local reputation and they invest in it. Um, they invest in it at the national level. So I said early on that we're a nonprofit outlet. We exist to counter the universe, the vast universe of outlets that are directly funded by the defense industry, by Pentagon contractors, the likes of Lockheed Martin, whatnot. Um, and we hope to both, do our own journalism and influence other outlets to take a public interest stance on these topics. So I'll go more into that, but I'll also like to let Faizi have a chance to introduce herself.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, I'm a lecturer at Goldsmiths at the University of London, and yeah, I'm very much interested in the way that workers, working class people can influence both in terms of addressing the climate crisis, but also, as you say, Taylor, the whole kind of the sort of imperialist system which keeps structurally endless war and endless preparation for war in place. I mean, I think if any section of society can start to kind of overturn the existing state of things, I think it is working people, both, within the arms industry and outside of it. So I'm also, in addition to sort of teaching and research, I'm also an anti-war activist in the UK. And I suppose towards the end, I want to sort of mention one initiative that I'm involved in, which is kind of on a European wide level, which people might sort of be interested to look out for in terms of how it pans out. But I definitely think we need more kind of international solidarity initiatives on linking up our different movements, not only to try and learn from each other, but also to really cooperate on trying to turn around this very dangerous world we live in.
Fantastic. Thank you, Faizi. Um, what I'm about to present on is a research paper that was commissioned from a new think tank called the Transition Security Project, which investigates the US and UK military industrial complexes as climate threats and proposes just transition policies for societies to disentangle themselves from them. And the think tank asked me to write a report about labor inside the U.S. military-industrial complex. And this is a topic I know well because as I embarked on this beat, one thing I was told early on, and I could see very resonant and very frequent in the um, narrative and marketing and self-promotion of the arms industry itself was the image that they are a great job creator and that they are a source of economic mobility. And I wanted to start diving into that. And what I basically found in my reporting and then in this report is that, yes, there was a time during the Cold War in which working at the likes of a Lockheed Martin, most certainly for plenty of people, was a ticket into the middle class. These were often manufacturing jobs with high union rates, pensions, specific pipeline programs that pipelined particularly workers of color in the South, Black workers, into these jobs that were indeed ticket out of poverty. I should note this think tank report comes out tomorrow, so I'm sort of summarizing it for you guys now, and I will be able to share the link to it tomorrow. Um, just to give one example, here in the Atlanta area, I had the opportunity to visit the Union Hall, the now greatly diminished union that represents blue collar workers at Lockheed Martin's aircraft plant that produces, among other things, a cargo plane called the C-130 that the U.S. military and various militaries use. Um, and I mean, I met workers who described absolutely abject poverty, nowadays retired with the union. I met a woman who was a teenage single mother from Rome, Georgia. This is a very U.S. reference, but this is not. This is Marjorie Taylor Greene's district, a very conservative, yeah, very Republican district. She was a black mother who said that she needed to get out of there, and lo and behold, a pipeline program during the Carter administration called the Comprehensive Employment and Training Act funneled her into Lockheed Martin in the Atlanta area, and this was a game changer. Most certainly brought her out of poverty. Um, she was able to enroll her child in a specific daycare for manufacturing employees. Nowadays lives on the generous pension that she earned in that union career. And she said she didn't even know that they made aircraft, let alone ones for the military. All she knew was that it paid far more and had far more job security than anything she had seen beforehand. I met another retiree from Lockheed here in the Marietta area who was illiterate when he joined Lockheed Martin, again, back in this Cold War heyday of peak union strength, um, and described how he wanted to rise to the ranks of becoming a blueprint reader and quietly went to the local library to get literacy classes. And again, was able to very much get a solid foot in the middle class. I mean, these are people who when I met, retired with pensions, other have used that funding to start their own small businesses and small ventures. So this is one of the more classical images of the military-industrial complex and what it meant for workers that lives on in the mind, or at least the propaganda of both members of Congress and the arms industry itself. And the reality has radically changed. Um, Also, I want to invite anyone to just post questions in the chat, and if I don't see them, just feel free to go ahead and anyone can feed them out to me. Um, so, just diving into some of the numbers regarding the arms industry, employment in the private U.S. arms industry, i.e., the Northrop Grumman's, Lockheed Martin's, Raytheons of the world, has plummeted over in recent decades despite Pentagon budgets increasing. So if you compare the 1980s Reagan era spending peak, that's the era of, Star Wars, nuclear arms race, some 3.2 million workers were employed in the sector. Nowadays, that number is down to 1.1 million, and that's despite the Pentagon budget, inflation adjusted, rising 20% over the same time period. And that's for a variety of reasons that I can get into and that are only accelerating in the current era. And what's very remarkable about that drop is that inflation adjusted salaries also dropped over the same time. So you may think, okay, sure, there's fewer jobs, less employment in the sector, but are they better ones? Is it more scientists, more engineers, whatnot? No. And these figures come from nothing other than the National Defense Industrial Association, which is a lobbying and advocacy group on behalf of the contractors themselves. Um, and they say that salaries over the same time have dropped from an average of about $100,000 to about $80,000. A very key turning point in the arms industry for blue collar workers came around the 2008 financial crisis, in that era when contractors began slashing pensions. And this was a crucial form this was a crucial benefit that really encouraged company loyalty. So, for example, going back to those same retirees that I mentioned at Lockheed Martin here in the Atlanta area, um, they many of them had plenty of criticisms of what the company actually made and of U.S. endless war, but they also had plenty to say about how both their great working conditions and that pension transformed, their professional lives, their personal finances, and represents just a generational shift into the middle class for them. And the era of pensions is largely gone, and often what remains are older workers who are grandfathered into more beneficial working conditions with pensions, and younger ones who don't get it, which then creates a rift in some of the few unionized workplaces that remain in the arms industry, where the younger ones resent the older ones who have that. I had a shop steward at Boeing, a young shop steward at Boeing in St. Louis, which makes fighter jets, munitions, and is a main hub of weapons for the Israeli military, um, tell me that some of the older members of his union had a motorcycle show where they were going to ride their motorcycles for some fundraiser. And they came and complained to him and said, "Why aren't the young workers coming to our motorcycle show?" And he said, "We can't afford motorcycles." So, um, one thing we also present in this report is we estimate that about 10 to 14% of those 1.1 million jobs in the sector nowadays are union jobs. And this is a dramatic drop from that Cold War mid-century era that lives on in the imagination, like I said, of policymakers. Just for an example, I've been able to dig back into some of the old corporate records from top armaments industry companies, and the Lockheed Martin mid-century had a union participation rate that was over 69%, and manufacturing rates in general for union participation were around 50% in that Cold War era. Um, Nowadays, top companies, if they are publicly traded, generally report their union participation rates in Securities and Exchange Commission forms called Forms 10K, so you can get a pretty precise number for them. And a place like Northrop Grumman, which we report quite a lot on, it's the world's largest nuclear weapons manufacturer, literally has a union participation rate of 4%. It's lower even than the U.S. economy-wide average. Um, so those are just some of the takeaways, some of the findings in our report. Um, I wanted to go into just a bit of sort of what's behind that drop in employment. Like I said, those that large drop you see from the Cold War era, from the 80s until now. And one major force, of course, is automation, um, which has been affecting workers, all along. And I've been told a variety of stories of, what this looks like in the workplace, that, a function building an aircraft engine that used to require four people now requires one. And I'll get into this in a bit, but this is the sort of new class of tech bros turned Pentagon contractors, i.e. Anduril, SpaceX, whatnot, are promising to double down on this even more, which would mean that the era of the 1 trillion to perhaps 1.5 trillion Pentagon budget very much may not be one that actually increases employment that much. Um, and other things that have tamped down on employment is an increasing proportion of white collar workers as opposed to blue collar workers. You can see this, and again, in those same company SEC forms, you'll see this in when they report the percentage of their workforce that are scientists and engineers. And certain spending priorities within the Trump administration also promise to double down on this, most notably the quote unquote Golden Dome. Anyone stop me if I'm getting into the weeds right now, but um, the Golden Dome is, even in Trump's own words, a revival of the Reagan era Star Wars, which is a would-be missile shield over the United States, i.e., intercepting missiles as they come in and thus making yourself impervious to nuclear war. Um, Look at the current Middle East war and see how well those interceptors are doing and whether they would, they are routinely failing to prevent much lower grade and less sophisticated missiles from coming in to, U.S. bases and to Israel, let alone imagine a more sophisticated adversary, the likes of Russia or China, shooting off its intercontinental ballistic missiles to the United States and thus relying on this would-be missile shield. However, Star Wars in the Reagan era and the Golden Dome in the current era is very likely to be a flood of money for research and development, which then translates into often white-collar jobs, as opposed to blue-collar ones, since if such a project never actually reaches mass production of these would-be interceptor missiles. Um, I did want to, I wanted to mention, I'm scanning through my own report right now. Even though I'm emphasizing that employment has tremendously dropped in the private arms industry and that union rates have also plummeted, it is important to know there are a few key large labor union sites in the arms industry that are well known to policymakers and that I think are important for anyone who wants to sort of critically engage the space to be aware of. For example, shipyards that belong to Huntington Ingalls, which is the largest U.S. military shipbuilder by far in both Mississippi and in Virginia, have thousands of unionized workers, largely with the steel workers. Lockheed Martin, which produces the most expensive weapons project in U.S. history, the F-35 fighter jet, has thousands of unionized workers at its Fort Worth aircraft plant. And furthermore, Electric Boat in Connecticut, which produces nuclear submarines, including ballistic missile submarines, ones that will launch ballistic missiles for nuclear warfare, also has thousands of unionized workers. But again, these are some of the outliers and some of the outliers and a glimpse of what these work sites used to look like. Just to add, like I said, this is a rapidly changing industry, and the entry of the tech bros, these venture capital backed defense corporations that say they're going to shake up the status quo in military contracting, really does have big implications for these union sites. So, for example, just a few weeks ago, Huntington Ingalls invited me to their press conference in which they signed a memorandum of understanding with a robotics and artificial intelligence manufacturing startup, which claims they are going to automate away shipyard jobs at Huntington Ingalls properties all the way up through assembly. And they described, a very perhaps aspirational vision of autonomous robots all working together to get all of these, all of these inputs ready until the point of assembly. But this again has very big implications for those few labor unions that do, or major union sites that do remain. Um, I know this is a broad audience, to sort of introduce a major player. Like I said, unions are a minority of the private arms industry in the United States nowadays. That said, it's important to know that the largest union by far in this space is the International Association of Aerospace Workers and Machinists, also known as the Machinist Union. To be clear, again, the vast majority of the U.S. arms industry is not in a labor union, and the vast majority of machinists, about, I believe, 600,000 members strong, are not in the arms industry. That said, the Machinist Union has a long niche in aircraft manufacturing, which then brings them into the arms industry. Um, I am going to, I think I'm going to skip ahead. Well, yeah, I'm going to skip ahead a bit to, actually, I'll go back to another part I wanted to mention. Um, Back on why, why the arms industry is not a great, source of employment. Um, the economist Dr. Heidi Peltier has analyzed job creation data related to different public spending priorities. And she has long pointed out that the arms industry is one of the worst ways, i.e., defense spending, Pentagon spending, to create jobs, given that it is so capital intensive as opposed to sectors that are much more labor intensive, for example, education and healthcare, whatnot. And I think the rise of the likes of Anduril are really going to double down on that because they claim they're also going to be using such advanced automated processes in their manufacturing. One important company to watch is a manufacturer called Hadrian, which claims it's going to set up flexible, nimble manufacturing spaces across the US to serve the arms industry and quote unquote prime contractors, Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, and whatnot. And they say they're going to be able to do this with as little as 10% of the labor usually required. Again, some of this stuff may be hype and it may be aspirational, but it's important to watch out because they are indeed setting up the factories to do it. In one report, they claimed that they wouldn't even have 3 shifts of work. They claimed they would have a daytime shift that sets up all the robots, and then the rest just autonomously functions for 24 hours. Um, I, let's see, I wanted to finish by um, one reason I wrote this report and for this audience, and I'm speaking with people here, is that there has been a history of antipathy or hesitance between folks in the disarmament space and the labor unions in the arms industry. And this is both obvious and understandable that those two groups would see themselves as odds. That said, I also think that there is a history of um, workers in the arms industry, particularly those in labor unions, being some of the best voices and some of the most articulate and persuasive voices, articulating a way out of it. Um, One keynote here in the U.S. context is that why is it important or advantageous for someone who is in a labor union in the arms industry to speak out as opposed to someone who is not in a labor union? In the US, the vast majority of workers are subject to what is called at-will employment, which means you can be fired at any point for any reason or no reason at all, with very limited exceptions. Therefore, it is generally not a good idea to publicly speak up against your employer if you are not in a labor union. If you are in a labor union, you are not subject to at-will employment. You have much more of a process. You get to sort of you get to contest your firing. Um, that is why it is not surprising that folks who are in labor unions often are the ones who are most willing to speak up about their employers. Just to give an amusing example, when I once spoke with a shop steward at United Launch Alliance outside Huntsville, Alabama, which makes rockets for both the military and for NASA, and I said something along the lines of like, "Wow, I'm really impressed. Like, how many of your workers are speaking to me on the record, don't have any problem?" And he said, "Oh no, don't worry about it. They mouth off about their employer on Facebook all day long. We're not that worried about getting fired." And I thought, this is pretty impressive. I mean, most American workers are. Um, with that umbrella about how I do believe folks who are interested in disarmament have both a history of productively engaging workers in the arms industry and have even more opportunities to do so, I wanted to highlight a very charismatic figure in the history of the U.S. military-industrial complex, who I think is very much worth knowing, and that is none other than the former president of the Machinists Union, William Wimpesinger, most notably during the sort of end of the Cold War, who was a fiery, self-described quote-unquote seat of the pants socialist, and despite or alongside being president of the largest labor union in the arms industry, was an outspoken disarmament activist and literally the co-chair of SANE, which was at the time sort of the preeminent nuclear disarmament organization in the US. And I've tried to research the why, what emboldened him to speak out in so many ways. And I believe it was a combination of indeed personal integrity and personal belief, and also reading the tea leaves and seeing that this was an industry that was one of declining employment for his sector. And the Machinist Union under Wimpesinger did some extraordinary things, and I was able to get access to an academic archive the Machinist Union maintains here in Atlanta, which is their birthplace, because they have they're born of the railroad industry here in Atlanta. And I mean, they're just remarkable documents of the kind of things they sent to their workers, the kind of things they published. They published an entire chart called The Effect of Pentagon Spending on the Machinist Union. Pentagon spending goes up, jobs go down. And they made a very visual case of that increasing both the tax burden and the displaced opportunity cost of increased military spending cost them jobs in other sectors where they would have been employed. For example, aircraft manufacturing for leisure vacations, where that their members would have made. Wimpesinger, he was routinely on national television. He was known to lawmakers in D.C. And he routinely pointed his finger at the profiteering class and allied himself with the grassroots groups that challenged it. In one paper that he wrote and they sent to members, he wrote, After more than 30 years and 1.8 trillion, the Pentagon has enough hydrogen bombs to blow up the world several times over. But each year, the brass comes up with a new list of ever more sophisticated, complicated, and expensive weapons it must have. Um, he yeah, again, very charismatic. He also in one media interview he said, I reject the idea that the only way to spend less on defense in the future is spending like pardon me if I can curse or not, an SOB in the present. The future never comes. Do arms increase world tensions or don't they? um and again, so and Wimpesinger, passed away in the 90s, but there are still insiders inside the Machinists Union who keep his legacy alive. Most remarkably, just a few years ago, a longtime sort of climate activist, labor union activist from a military contractor in Connecticut called Pratt and Whitney, which makes aircraft engines, and nowadays is part of Raytheon. Um, Spent a long lobbying campaign lobbying his union to produce a green jobs report about sort of a climate friendly future for the machinist union. When he first presented the idea, he was shot down at their national conference, and then he gave this very stirring speech, described his union once being reluctant to endorse civil rights because they had a largely white workforce, and being reluctant to speak out about secondhand smoke in the workplace because they represented tobacco workers, and nowadays they shake their head in rue. And after this very moving speech, he was able to win the motion to get his union to kick off this green jobs, climate jobs X-ray. Um, and so these voices exist on the inside, and I think are very, very worth engaging and are remarkable, and also are not, not a full contradiction, I would say. I have been shocked with the stories that workers have shared with me over time. I'll end with one. Um, I'll send with one now. That same shop steward I mentioned at Boeing in St. Louis, again, a major hub of U.S. weapons bound for the Israeli military, went to his executive board, asked for permission to speak about the genocide in Gaza at their upcoming union meeting, at their upcoming gathering, had to fight his way through, was able to get to do it. And when he spoke about it, he said a few people booed him, and then a few other ones said, "Thank you for spitting the truth." We wrote about this at Inkstick Media. So again, this is a tough needle to thread, but I think there's a remarkable history of folks inside the arms industry also challenging it, and I believe that really the only way out of it is through it, and there's really no sidestepping the power of the military-industrial complex in the U.S. So I'll end it there, but I would love to talk more about this.
Great. Thank you, Taylor. Congrats. Very, very, very interesting. Please, Facey, your turn.
Super. Thank you, Taylor, so much. Yeah, I mean, first, I would like to thank the Trade Unions and Labour Environmentalism Network and the Transition Security Project for organizing this event, and to Vinnie Collins for the invitation to discuss this brilliant report by Taylor. And I'm so glad I've also heard it from you as well. And thanks everyone for joining us. I think the report is significant not only because it adds to our arsenal of research exposing the myth that is still touted by governments, including in the UK, that the defense sector is a source of job creation and economic mobility for workers in the industry, but also because this kind of research is absolutely needed in a context of shifting geopolitical tensions, and the implications of what we're seeing, which is U.S. sort of imperial decline, a potential global arms race, the normalization of might is right, the total disregard for international law and the sort of post World War II international order. And it's all an extremely dangerous situation. But as I was saying at the beginning, I think if there's any section of society that is capable of overturning this existing state of things, I think it is the vast majority in society, working people. And I think it will involve both those within the arms industry and outside of it. And I think we need to kind of draw on these traditions that you talk about, Wimpesinger and others. I wanted to ask maybe a few questions, maybe three questions, and then get your thoughts, and then maybe a couple of more questions after that, sort of more sort of commentary, particularly on the kind of on the initiatives that you were talking about, sort of what what is to be done, basically. So the statistics you cite are staggering, on one level. More or less 2 million jobs lost over the
Right.
last 3 decades in these private defense firms, and salaries dropping, even as you say, while budgets have increased over 22%. And if Trump gets his way with another 50%, that kind of that's set to rise even further in terms of what you say in
Right.
terms of the shrinkage of jobs and salaries and so on. So and then what you say, what you find in terms of the kind of 10 to 14% of that workforce being
Yeah.
unionized. So essentially the vast majority non-unionized, fragmented, precarious, and so on. I guess my first question is, can you sort of clarify or elaborate upon the connection between the low unionization rates, and you go through some of the figures, which is fascinating, and the reasons why, the automation, the subcontracting, and
Mhm.
anti-union campaigns even. But can you say more about the connection between uh, sort of those trends of low unionization and the increasing revenues of the arms industry? In other words, there may be, that they can get what they want in terms of the fewer strikes and work stoppages
Yeah.
and more predictable labor relations and flexibility and so on. And clearly the companies prefer non-unionized plans.
Mhm. Right.
Lots of companies do. But
Right.
how does low unionization translate into profits for the sector?
Absolutely. Thank you. No, thank you for asking that. I mean, absolutely. If I may kind of to frame this, I have in the past come across, voices in the disarmament world who will express antipathy toward the labor unions within it and say, this is a quote, this is something I heard a while ago, but for example, why would we speak to the machinists union? They're on the other side. And my first thought is, you know what? Lockheed Martin thanks you. They would be thrilled if the machinist union had no allies and no friends. They are a thorn in their side. Um, I was once told by machinist labor leaders here in the Atlanta area at that Marietta aircraft plant that the labor negotiator for the company approached them and said, our labor strategy is to outsource everything, subcontract and outsource every function that doesn't touch the plane. Therefore, that's how we're busting your union, by getting rid of the firefighters, by getting rid of the staff nurse, by getting rid of the groundskeepers, making them all subcontractors. Therefore, they can't be a part of the bargaining unit. Um, I think this is a way that companies press to always be able to report greater returns and greater revenues for their shareholders, have to find everything to chip away at, and to chip away at pensions, and of course chip away at those hourly wages is terrific for them. Um, Another important statistic that we included in this report is that turnover in the sector far outpaces that of the U.S. economy overall. It's of over 13%, whereas the U.S. economy overall, I believe, is something like 3 or 4% or so. What does that mean? It means workers are speaking with their feet. These are not desirable working conditions for many people. Um, so yes, I think this most certainly goes hand in hand with increasing revenues and finding anything to cut as their programs, of course, have otherwise out of control cost. For example, the F-35, most famously, in development and production since literally the 90s, and still, only recently entered full rate production and is only mission capable a third of the time. They have many other concerns to attend to, and keeping labor costs down is quite advantageous.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I just wanted to, that kind of relates to the second question, which was your point about venture capitalists in the weapons industry bringing with them their right-wing
Yeah,
politics and alliances and so on. I thought that was,
yeah,
you know, fascinating and who of course prefer no labor unions at all in their workforce.
Yes.
And you note that there were, of course, in the Cold War era, the sort of anti-communist conservatives in the defense industry and so on. But could you, I suppose, elaborate on what is the difference with this lot?
Yes.
Anduril, Palantir, SpaceX, and so on. Palantir is involved in developing, the AI-enabled military technologies in the Middle East now, for
Yeah.
example. I mean, with these AI decision support systems, the International Institute for Strategic Studies just put out a report. On this. So they were these decision support systems were identifying targets across Iran in the current war, some of which we know, of course, were civilian, 37,000 targets. But how does this, and so, these are sort of also linked to kind of Israeli companies and so on. How does this rightward trend in the US arms industry then, you argue, present a window of opportunity to
Yeah.
push to the left, as you suggest,
Yeah.
on defense budgets?
Absolutely. So, just to sort of set the stage for the Cold War era of the arms industry, I'm going to borrow a term from historian Dr. Michael Brenes, who refers to the quote unquote Cold War Coalition, which was this alliance between, the hawkish voices, the arms industry, the military brass, the true anti-communist conservatives, with labor unions and Democrats who sought an economy of full employment, and they came together to use the Pentagon budget for that goal. And with that being the odd, the bedfellows who came together to support that program, they're, the likes of Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, whatnot. I'm going to use perhaps a silly word, but are more polite than the likes of Anduril and Palmer Luckey and Alex Karp of Palantir. And there's a very palpable shift in the mood and the tone of the arms industry as Palmer Luckey, as this new crop of venture capital backed Silicon Valley and Origin tech bros make their entrance with their own right wing politics. To give just one colorful, just one example of that, we've documented this at Inkstick Media. This might sound amusing, but it used to not be uncommon for the arms industry to sponsor local LGBTQ pride parades. Yeah, Boeing did it. I've been told Northrop Grumman did it sometimes in Utah. That is gone in the Trump era when DEI is no longer cool. Um, no longer, gaining you favor with your client, which is the federal government. Similarly, those same contractors also cut their DEI stats from their annual reports that they report to the SEC, how many women they employ, how many workers of color they have. Um, and if you even just look at the tone and the public rhetoric of the like, I keep saying Anduril because he's something of the leader of the pack, the company that is trying to position itself as the leader of these new venture capital backed defense tech startups. Um, is so much more explicitly right wing than you would ever see an executive at Northrop Grumman, Lockheed Martin behave. This is just one example that I see in the media, but there have been a few media reports recently that have been very bruising for Anduril. One in Wired magazine about many mishaps and worker safety at its Mississippi plant, and one from the Wall Street Journal about Ukrainian military officers declining to use their drones, about a forest fire that the company caused and couldn't control in Oregon. And I'm used to sending companies, requests for comment, and they're about adversarial topics, and what they always are is silent. They don't want to engage. Anduril is the opposite. It posts like extremely MAGA-inflected, angry comments online, puts them straight in the article. So it's very much a tone shift that I think reflects, the very much rightward shift in the industry, that breakup of the Cold War coalition. And then Anduril, SpaceX, Palantir, they have zero unionized workers in the United States, and which I think the direction that the industry is going then presents a window of opportunity for people in the disarmament space to engage the workers that do remain in the arms industry about their sort of dwindling stakes in it, and about how they are unlikely to fare well under under an Anduril, under a Huntington Ingalls that is trying to automate away their jobs through robotics and automation. So,
Yeah, okay, great. Yeah, that makes sense. And we can kind of I'll we can talk more about this
yeah.
in a bit. So I suppose relatedly, you also note twice in the report that contemporary efforts to pursue the kind of economic conversion that that we've kind of mentioned and that we know about must contend with this largely
Yeah.
non-union, nature of the industry, and the increasing transience and turnover of the
Yeah.
workforce. And you rightly point out that unions are an important entry point for discussions about conversion. So
Right.
how do you see conditions of low unionization again as an opportunity for renewed attention on economic conversion of industries into socially useful? It's definitely more urgent now, but how is it
Yeah.
more open, do you think?
Right. I would say it is more open because you have a generation of workers that do have less company loyalty. Again, the pensions are gone, turnover is high. One example we mentioned in the report, this, is a blip on, in media mentions, but is pretty significant when it comes to the military industrial complex, was that a few years ago, Lockheed Martin transitioned a fighter jet line that was in the union shop in Fort Worth to South Carolina, which is kind of a slap in the face to labor unions. It's one of the most, Republican, right wing, very red states that is very hostile to labor unions. I've been able to speak. I had, one disaffected worker from that plant reach out to me to describe conditions on the inside of just, how, yeah, the high turnover, the threat that you can lose your job any day, for people who've often like packed up and moved across the country to work in this place. Um, I think it's tricky actually to try to engage a workforce with that kind of turnover and with that low loyalty. At the same time, there's the window of opportunity to engage people who, again, are pretty open-minded to alternatives. When, I mean, he described wages as low as $19 an hour, for people who are looking at jobs that's, only marginally better than what they are getting in other hourly wage sectors of the economy. The same shop steward at Boeing in St. Louis told me his colleagues are routinely working gig economy jobs, extra shifts as security guards, as Uber drivers, food delivery. I remember his quote that was along the lines of, if your local aircraft manufacturer is a low wage job, imagine what the next low wage job in town is. So some folks are looking at some pretty poor options, which again makes it more urgent to pursue a more just future.
Um, and I suppose uh, absolutely. I mean, that's
Yeah.
sorry. 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 Um,
Okay.
Uh, the recounting, the recounting of Wimsinger's experiences, I think, are of convincing workers in the defense industry of the need to restrict the production of military hardware was really valuable, I thought, and it brought alive some of the arguments of I think what we need to be, the arguments that we ha need to be having now. And you talk about how he made these arguments to his members and others, and that people could quickly recognize and realize to a certain extent how the massive military budgets and the militarization of civilian life really undermined democratic prospects,
Right.
economic and so on, their lives essentially.
Right.
Um, and Miriam Pemberton's book, Six Stops on the National Security Tour, also recounts how Walter Reuther, the leader of the United Auto Workers, argued for war production plants to be turned into facilities that could
Right.
produce modern railway equipment and low-cost housing. She says it didn't happen because of an aversion to planning, of course, on the part of military firms, but
Right.
also because the government focus was, on a whole new set of national security concerns, like plus ça
Right.
change, right? And of course we have, Lucas Aerospace example and
Yeah.
others as well. But what we're seeing now is kind of in some cases industrial production in the opposite direction.
Yes.
Volkswagen, um, this case is wanting to potentially repurpose one of its plants next year to produce components for the Iron Dome air
Yeah.
defense system. It's in talks with Israeli Rafael Advanced Defense Systems about this. So, here we have a car manufacturer, you know, not directly producing weapons from beginning to end, but becoming integrated into a defense supply chain. So this is kind of the direction of travel, really, which is worrying. So my question, is that kind of in all these cases, particularly in the kind of conversion ones to green and socially useful ends,
Yeah.
because proposals were drawn up in these cases, there's presumably at least quite a lot of, worker support and so on. My question is around the kind of fight behind it. I
Yeah.
suppose, the kind of the threat of a strike or the threat of wider opposition beyond the sector. If you don't take this
Yeah.
proposal, we're gonna go out on strike, or we're gonna do something, for
Yeah.
the very reason that as Miriam kind of talks about, the state, in a way, it can't be relied upon for
Yeah.
pushing through this conversion, right? It could
Absolutely.
facilitate it, and certainly the kind of changes that we need, and at the speed and the scale that we need to address the climate crisis requires the state. But the
Right.
state won't do it without pressure from below. The
Yes.
state always finds these new security threats, right? Whether it was during the Cold War, post-Cold War, and
Yeah.
more explicitly now in this kind of new gangster phase of imperialism, as some have called
Right.
it. So I just wondered if you could comment on that, the kind of fight behind, or the potential for a fight behind. Look, we've got these proposals.
Yeah.
Um, what are you going to do about it if
Yeah.
we really come
Yeah.
out with these threats?
Yeah, absolutely. No, I'm going to borrow Miriam's phrase now, and like I said, she's really just a mentor and inspiration in this area. But there's, what the U.S. needs is a new national mission, and then a mission, a national mission since the birth of the modern military-industrial complex around the Second World War, the beginning of the Cold War, is endless war, and no one can blame workers who say, no, I do fear I'm going to be thrown under the bus because they have been. They're not wrong. And it's a very tough and tall ask, and I think it requires goodness. It would require true trust that something else is coming their way. And look at the current political moment. I mean, look at the instability, look at the upheaval, look how many promises are broken. Who can look at the US right now and think that, my politician has my back? Which is sometimes why I feel that, you know, this issue is almost we can try to propose a series of technical fixes, but at a certain point, it's a broken democracy issue as well. Um, and I mean, that's why these issues are so deeply intertwined of all the other ways that US society is fracturing. Um, I will note, since this is a crowd of academics, that when it is so hard to look at U.S. history and think, okay, what are some examples of swords into plowshares? What are examples of when, we have had to find an alternative? As Miriam points out, in what would have been the swords into plowshares moment post-Cold War during the 1990s, the U.S. administration under Clinton opted for conservative priorities, i.e., deficit reduction, rather than establishing a new national mission, and this sort of squandered the would-be peace dividend at that time. I do think it is useful at a community level to examine the process that was known as BRAC, which is the base realignment and closure, which is when the Pentagon would identify what it called excess capacity, bases that were no longer useful, and became an enormous political fight of representatives, Congress people saying, how dare you close the base in my community? This is our economic lifeline. And there has been some good work and research on the aftermath of these communities that did lose their military bases. Indeed, some have suffered. Indeed, like some of these bases are in parts of are in rural America, are highly contaminated. There really is only so much to do with them. Though some have actually had prosperous afterlives. For example, I profiled a shuttered military base in Maine that has increased its employment, diversified its economic base in a matter of like 10 years. And so I think that is one good area to dive into to understand sort of what a disarmament demilitarization process can look like. I hope that starts getting at your question. I also just want to say I understand when workers don't trust advocates who approach them and say, buy into this vision of a future with me.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think it's there, and I mean it's what you say in terms of making these connections also with
Yeah,
disarmament activists, anti-war activists, which in a way this is what Wimper Singer was calling for. I mean,
yeah.
so my final question is related to this. In all your interviews with workers in the industry, to what extent do they make links between weapons manufacturing and the climate crisis? And are kind of unionized workers more conscious about these questions? How have the unions themselves sort of taken up these questions more sort of explicitly? I mean, in the UK, we've got um, this General Secretary of Unite, Sharon Graham. Unite is the second biggest union in the country, 1.2 million members, something like that. Pushing for the government to guarantee an increase in defense spending.
Wow.
That
Wow.
money, yeah, should be spent on equipment produced in the UK rather than foreign alternatives to
Yeah.
support domestic jobs and skills. And of course, it's not been just taken. I mean, there's been a counter sort of, I don't know if you call it a movement, but there's been definitely, a counter sort of opposition to this in the form of, motions put to the trade union Congress around wages, not weapons, and arguing that there needs to be increased investment in public services instead of the military and so on. But I wonder whether we would be wise to take up some of Wimper Singer's calls
Yeah.
to bring workers and anti-war advocates
Yeah.
together to challenge the military-industrial complex. And in that vein, I think I absolutely agree with your policy recommendations. But
Yeah.
all of the things that you propose around, cutting the military budget and redirecting the military-industrial capacity and investing in the just transition and so on. All of these things, again, is going to require massive pressure
Yes.
from within and outside of the industry. And here I would argue, we're not starting from scratch, right? There is a vibrant Palestine movement, for
Yeah.
example, which hasn't
Yeah.
necessarily translated into a kind of wider anti-war movement, or at least not
Yeah.
here, against
Right.
Iran or the wars in the Middle East and Latin America. But it does seem to me that we need to be making these arguments in the unions, in the workplaces, in kind of wider society wherever we can through these kind of the interface of movements where that have the kind of some social weight in society that can amplify these kinds of debates. You know, I think we need a movement more broadly to kind of challenge the growing militarism.
Right.
As you say, sometimes once the arguments are made and people start talking about these things, then people are like, yeah, of course, I agree with that.
Right.
And thank God someone's talking about this and so on.
Right.
In a context where actually industrial struggle in most workplaces is quite low.
Yeah.
These movements, I think, on the streets and so on are crucial in kind of giving confidence to workers to start to take action
Right.
in their workplaces. I mean, we're not there yet, and it's a huge challenge. Um, but I think that is our challenge, right?
Right.
And I wondered if you would comment on that.
Yeah. No, that's a great question. And um, as far as the question of have I come across workers who connect sort of the climate crisis with the nature of their job? Not exactly, but the point I do want to make is I have never come across an arms industry worker who says, I love making weapons. That's not the motivation. They will say, I love having a great career. I like being in this workforce. I like, my job stability, which again is totally eroding. Um, and I have come across a public service mentality across them. I am keeping the country safe. I'm supporting our troops, and I'm supporting our communities. I am keeping the homeland safe. Um, that is very motivating, and that I think is an entry point, of course, for climate advocates and disarmament folks to engage and approach the workforce. Um, I was meant to mention one point. Yeah, and as far as yeah, and I've definitely come across younger workers who, I'm just to use shorthand, are completely woke, and have joined their workplaces because they want to be a part of a labor union and they want to be part, of a dynamic, a dynamic movement, and are also members of like the Democratic Socialist and whatnot. So those entry points totally exist. Um, One thing I did want to mention that I do believe is an entry point to engage workers is that, like I said, I've come across workers who are very motivated by this public service. I'm serving my country, I'm keeping my countrymen safe, and often are uncomfortable with foreign arms sales, which has, ratcheted in the United States, particularly post-Cold War, as these companies thought, as these companies faced, oh my goodness, will the Pentagon budget go down? I could either diversify to the civilian economy, or I could just try to sell more weapons abroad, and they chose the latter. I mean, the U.S. Sells weapons to more countries than not. Um, and I have come across a discomfort with that, and folks saying things along the lines of, I participate in the democracy here. I know what's going on here, but I don't know why this and that country is at war and why they want this weapon. And I think that's a really important entry point to engage workers. Um, to quote one of the op-eds from a machinist that I quoted in our report from David Story, who was a labor leader at United Launch Alliance, he said he uses the phrase of quote unquote, we need to right size the defense industry. And I think that is a phrase and an approach that resonates very much with workers inside the industry.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and then you can get into real questions and debates about what is that right size,
Yeah, right.
and then sort of, yeah, what's going on and what's possible, because I think
Right.
people, there's a question about what people feel is possible. And once you start
Yeah.
having these conversations, then maybe, sky's the limit in a way. Like you
Right.
can start to really, challenge things in a way that you thought were absolutely impossible, especially
Yeah.
at a sort of collective level. And just to finally say that not a question, but the thing that I was talking about in terms of what's happening at the European level is because the whole kind of tensions that Trump has raised in the kind of NATO alliance, and sort of putting European leaders, if you could call them that, in a position where they are having to increase their defense budgets by, the suggestion is 5% by 2030. Um, uh, there's been some coordination at the European level from the kind of anti-war movements in various countries, basically to say we want to coordinate a European-wide initiative. So there was basically to oppose this growing militarism. So there was a conference of 4,000 trade unionists
Well,
late last year in Paris, and then there's going to be one on the 20th of June in London as a follow-up to that, and it's called the International Anti-War Conference, or a peace conference. And the idea is to get this kind of really into workplaces. So at the moment, we've got about kind of 90 uh, very local branches and trade union branches and workplaces, who've passed motions in support of the conference, who are planning to come. We want to kind of fill this hall, which is Central Hall, Westminster, with, again, 4,000 trade unionists and others. And, we're trying to reach out to all sorts of climate organizations and so on, to really kind of get some coordination and to sort of to show that there is some kind of initiative taking place.
yeah.
Like the
Yeah.
the conscription is also up. So
Yeah.
there's been a lot of demonstrations by young people in Germany, saying, we're not going to accept this conscription,
Yeah.
and so on and on. So you can start to see how this can get into all kinds of different sectors in society, sections of society, really. And that's what I think is needed of people kind of working together across sectors, and to say we really oppose this, and to try and get those arguments out there, where really, the smallest trade union branch even is having this discussion about what
Yeah.
is this conference? What, can we actually say
Participate.
no to this militarism? Yeah, and
Yeah.
participate in this.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Um, I mean, I have to say, while you were speaking, I had one other example just kind of come to my mind when you said, like, what is it like to even discuss, like, do workers in these workplaces discuss the climate crisis? And it just kind of it reminded me how the Lockheed plant I mentioned here in the Atlanta suburbs in Marietta, quietly, little fanfare, indeed produces aircraft to combat the climate crisis. They produce a quote unquote Hurricane Hunter, a version of their military cargo plane that is, fortified and flies straight into the heart of a hurricane to get up-to-date conditions on it. And I just think, and workers are totally happy with that. That works just fine for them. So I think it's sort of important to find and elevate these stories and, yeah, find the path forward.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Taylor, of course, for your presentation, and Facey for your excellent comments, questions, and the dialogue that you just had. We still have at least, I mean, 10, 15 minutes if there's some Q&A. So please, I don't know if you want to write it on the chat or maybe raise your hand and just make the question or any comment. please feel free. Or I don't know, Taylor, if you want to say something else, or I mean, whatever.
No, I just want to thank everybody for their interest. And I, I dive into some very specific people and places that are tied up in this beat, but I hope this also gives an overarching picture of what the military-industrial complex looks like for working people in the U.S. and the very real people and places who are tied up in it. To give one other example of what that looks like, I literally